Have you been avoiding saturated fat for fear that it will somehow clog your arteries and lead to increased risk of cardiovascular disease, even premature mortality from heart disease? I think you might want to understand the findings of this new analysis, looking at observational studies, epidemiological studies, randomized clinical trials, and also systematic reviews, finding that there's little, if any, correlation or association with consuming saturated fat and its associated increases in any cardiovascular disease-related complication and death or mortality from heart disease. This is a new paper. The title here is Saturated Fat, Villain and Boogeyman in the Development of Cardiovascular Disease, ? And this was recently published actually in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology. So again, we're going to talk about the epidemiological or observational studies. We're going to talk about the RCTs and then the systematic reviews and then get to the conclusion. So what do the observational studies find? So this observational study, known as the PURE study, the Prospective Urban Rural Epidemiological Study, the largest ever epidemiological study involving over 135,000 people from 18 different countries. So again, large data set. Now, epidemiological studies can't suss out direction of causality, right? But what they found is that there's no correlation with fat intake, irrespective of the type of fat and cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, that is an event having a heart attack, or death from heart disease. No correlation. The largest epidemiological study published to date. Now, the UK Biobank study, which involves over 195,000 people, we've actually gleaned information from this data set with regards to COVID-19 outcomes, and this has been great, this UK Biobank data set. And this particular aspect of the data set, it's similar to like NHANES here in the US, followed people for over 10 years and found no evidence of dietary saturated fat intake and its links with heart disease, okay? And actually substituting saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat like canola oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, etc., soy oil, actually increase risk for cardiovascular disease. And the same study also showed that substituting fat and so forth for carbohydrates and starches and sugars, guess what? It increases the risk for cardiovascular disease and mortality. Now you might say, well, why is that, Mike? Remember, because cardiovascular disease and the so-called process of atherosclerosis is inflammatory in nature. It's linked with insulin resistance. And so we can't just say that consuming fat clogs your arteries when we know that if you're consuming processed carbohydrates, that leads to the underlying pathophysiology that creates inflammatory milieu that clogs your arteries, okay? Now, thirdly, there was a observational study. This was a Dutch study involving over 4,722 males and females and found that total saturated fat was not associated with cardiovascular disease. Now for the randomized control trials. We know that the RCTs are helpful. They can tease out causality and demonstrate cause and effect. And so the largest of the context here, we're talking about fat and so forth, the largest study looking at dietary saturated fat in heart disease was this PREDIMED study involving over 7,447 people between the ages of 55 and 80. They randomized people to 3 different diets. And what they found is that the Mediterranean diet, which I know is kind of loose, but it involves, fish and olives and things like that. What they found that the Mediterranean diet that is not necessarily low in fat or low in saturated fat, when it's supplemented with olive oil and nuts, had lower risk of cardiovascular disease related events compared to the low fat arm of the RCT. Okay, so again, the assertion here is that if it's the fats, particularly the saturated fats that are not necessarily totally low in a Mediterranean diet, if those fats are the problem, then how come in a randomized controlled trial where you have a intervention arm that is specifically standardized to have low fat, how come that arm actually has higher incidences of cardiovascular related events compared to the arm that is actually eating more fat? And again, the Mediterranean diet, you go to parts of the Mediterranean, there's lamb, there's fatty beef. It's not necessarily completely devoid of red meat that is so-called high in saturated fat. Okay. Now, I'm not going to read all, and there are several other randomized controlled trials that are talked about that are noteworthy, but I know you're not a statistician and so forth. And so let's get into the main findings here from the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And so what the authors go on to say here is findings from the studies on the association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease in the early and mid part of the past decade have been confirmed by recent studies. A narrative review of 19 meta-analysis, randomized controlled trials, and observational studies found no association between saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular disease. The meta-analysis of observational studies report in this review found no association between saturated fat intake and coronary heart disease, while meta-analysis of the randomized controlled trials reported in the review were inconsistent but tended to show lack of association. The conclusion was that the strength of evidence for the recommendation to limit saturated fat for coronary heart disease prevention may be outdated and is in need of a reevaluation. So I think that's really important. And they go on and talk about all the different aspects here and get into a lot of different things. But I think this is important, this sentence here. A review of 28 randomized controlled trials and 11 meta-analyses that examined diet and cardiovascular disease concluded that the preponderance of evidence indicates that low-fat diets do not reduce cardiovascular events or mortality. And they go on to then talk about why it's important that as this research shows inconsistent conclusions, especially with regard to these randomized controlled trials, the observational or epidemiological data, that we challenge the current paradigm in wake of this new evidence and the inconsistent observations and research. They go on to say in the discussion, the purpose of this comprehensive review was to critically examine the currently available scientific evidence on the association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, which will have implications for future dietary recommendations to reduce cardiovascular disease risk, events, and mortality. Our investigation expands upon prior investigations, investigating the association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, and adds to a growing body of evidence showing that saturated fat has no significant impact on cardiovascular disease and outcomes. The preponderance of evidence from meta-analyses and observational studies and clinical trials do not support the dietary recommendations to limit saturated fat to reduce the clinical cardiovascular risk and events and mortality. In fact, scientific evidence shows that the advice to remove saturated fat from diets has paradoxically increased cardiovascular risk. Okay, so they finish off here saying, it is evident that although the image of coronary arteries as kitchen pipes clogged with saturated fat, heart attacks is simple, familiar, and evocative, but it is plain wrong. They say this is captured well in the following statement. Saturated fat does not clog the arteries. Coronary heart disease is a chronic inflammatory condition, the risk of which can be effectively reduced from healthy dietary intervention. So I think it's important to understand that there's a preponderance of evidence suggesting that consuming saturated fat does not in fact increase your risk for developing a future coronary artery related event or cardiovascular disease and increase your risk of mortality.
I mean, in a paper that I was a co-author on, we analyzed our own U.S. dietary guidelines, the expert committee, and their recent review on saturated fats for our 2020 guidelines, the most recent version. Their review, I looked at all the studies that they had used for their review, and I found that like something between 70 and 100% of their studies, depending on what the outcomes were, did not support their conclusion. So the vast majority did not support the idea that saturated fats cause heart disease. And yet their conclusion was the evidence that saturated fats cause heart disease is strong.
Yeah.
Right? Top level recommendation. Although 70 to 100% of the studies that they provided for that recommendation showed exactly the opposite from what they said. So, so this is an area where there's a lot of interest pushing against any liberation of saturated fats, and the science is clearly not being heard.
Yeah.
I'm just going to point out one point, because I think that, when you talk to this vegan guest, that the arguments that are often put forward and is that saturated fats cause inflammation, saturated fats have negative effects on cholesterol. But remember, these are all inflammation and cholesterol are what's called intermediary outcomes, right? They're important to measure, but they don't always predict heart attacks or death. And so it's really important to know that these large clinical trials that I talked about from the 1960s and 70s, they went long enough or were powered. And it means, in other words, they had enough people in them to look at heart attacks and death, right? Death is the ultimate outcome, as we might call it in science, because it's really important to know, maybe you are are not having as many, maybe you're having more heart attacks, but what if it causes cancer instead, which is in fact what these trials found in some instances, which is that the people on the high vegetable oil diets were dying at higher rates of cancer.
Mm.
So you might be seeing some of these intermediary effects on inflammation and LDL cholesterol, but really, when you have hard outcome data on heart attacks and death, that trumps any other data you might have. It might be that the data, this intermediary data, was not quite correct or transitory, as we found out with LDL cholesterol. So really, it's the hard, firm outcomes, what we call hard outcomes of heart attacks and death, that were studied, we have data on, and they showed that saturated fats, when replaced by vegetable oils, do not reduce cardiovascular events or reduce mortality.
And so you were saying also before, like vegetable oils, how these came up. I mean, that's one of the arguments, is that, humans. Yeah, I mean, since I was a kid, I was always taught that, humans are apex predators, top of the food chain. That was very clear as far as the data was concerned. At least, when I was growing up, that was what people were. It wasn't even a discussion. That was just, this is pretty straightforward. This is what the data shows. Now people are saying, well, no, not only is it unethical to eat meat, we actually never ate meat. We actually only ate plants, and we're actually herbivores for all these different strange reasons. But even if you were to argue that, I don't see how anyone can argue that we evolved on seed oils, because those didn't exist. Those are a manufactured product. But what's the story behind those, and what, obviously you dug into the data, quite thoroughly. What are the health ramifications of seed oils?
So seed oils, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, they were the original one was cottonseed oil that was pressed out of cotton seeds. They were a byproduct of the cotton crop in the southern part of the United States, and that oil was used to lubricate machinery, which was important in the late 1800s, because whale oil had been dependent upon heavily, but whales were being hunted nearly to extinction. So they needed a new source of oil. Here was cottonseed. And then various entrepreneurs looked at this oil and thought, well, we can use it. It's cheap. We'll use it and sneak it into butter. And we'll see if we can. And there was adulterated butter that came into being in the late sort of the turn of the 19th century. So, and then there was a soap maker and a candle maker. There's Procter and Gamble, were these two men who, in 1911, they introduced a product called Crisco. Well, Crisco was really the first human, the first food product for human consumption that was made from these oils. And they had these, Procter and Gamble had figured out how to harden the oil, which was critical, because oils in their oil form are highly unstable. They oxidize easily, they go rancid. So they had figured out how to harden it through a process called hydrogenation, or partial hydrogenation, which is a big industrial process involving a metal chelate. And they made Crisco. They marketed it with a huge amount of marketing dollars, and this is what and convinced people that this was a safer and better than butter. There's just a really fascinating history around this, about how they were able to convince housewives. Butter comes from slaughterhouses cattle are dirty, and lard comes, you have to kill animals to create lard, but Crisco comes from a clean, shiny laboratory, and it's a new thing. And of course, Americans were always into the new thing, because people had emigrated to America to be in a new place and leave their grandmother's recipes behind. People wanted to assimilate. This was part of being an American. then in the 1940s, there was further developments in chemistry labs where they figured out how to sell the oil as oil, and how to stabilize it in oil form. And all of a sudden, we had Crisco oil, and we had all different brands of oils that were touted as being good for cooking and frying. Use them in your salads, and a super interesting fact around this time was that Procter and Gamble really they poured like millions of dollars into the American Heart Association in the late 1940s, which I discovered through Procter and Gamble's own company history, a book you can't get anymore now since I reported on it. Everything disappears from the internet the moment you publish something. And of course, Procter and Gamble went on to recommend these vegetable oils to prevent heart attacks. So, and they still to this day get money and have a relationship with Procter and Gamble. But so then we saw the rise of vegetable oils because they were dubbed as being good for health. They lowered your cholesterol. They were better than saturated fats, endorsed by the American Heart Association, and that has seen this tremendous rise in the use of vegetable oils. But just briefly to go over, like, what are their health effects? Well, that instability and oxidation turns out to be a big problem. I mean, I think all of us have heard of antioxidants. Why do we take antioxidants? Why do we think those were a good idea? Because oxidation is bad for human health. It drives inflammation. And these oils they oxidize. What that means is they basically, the molecules, their bonds kind of open up and bond with oxygen. That's oxidation. And this happens especially quickly if you leave an oil out in the sunlight or if they're heated. Remember, your early chemistry experiments, if you heated something, that would speed up the reaction. That happens when you heat oils. So there's a huge literature that I sort of dug up and cover in my book about the problems of heating these vegetable oils and how they create these hundreds of oxidation products. Some of them are known toxins like acrolein, which is actually identified as a toxin. So aldehydes is another one, a known toxin that is known to cause heart disease, to cause cancer. So, and those oxidative products, they enter into the food supply. That's been studied. There are over 200 oxidation products that were found in a single piece of fried chicken from Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they've also been shown to pass through the blood-brain barrier. They get into your brain. So there is really, they hang out in every cell membrane, which is your membrane of your cell controls what goes in and out. And if you have them in your cell membranes, your cells are not as intelligent as they should be. So they are, heat, especially when heated, they are very unstable and dangerous products for human health. And just one other finding, which I mentioned earlier, which is that in those large clinical trials where they had one group on the high saturated fat diet, the other group was having a high vegetable oil diet. And those studies, in 5 or 6 of those studies, they had what they call the inconvenient finding that the people on the high vegetable oil diet were dying at higher rates from cancer.
Yeah.
They were so concerned about that finding that there were 3 or 4 high-level meetings at the National Institutes of Health where they gathered everybody together to try to figure out what to do about this finding, and they couldn't figure it out. And there was just basically these inconclusive reports, and they said, well, we still believe we should tell people to reduce saturated fats, replace them with vegetable oils, because that's so important for our public health message.
Yeah.
So those findings have never been explained. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the story of seed oils is starting to get more publicity, but it's, it remains something. And I think in the community of people who understand about sugars and starches, there's a lot of information also about seed oils, so people understand that. But but this all of this story and this history and these health effects are, I think, are not yet really understood in the mainstream scientific communities.